I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, I am Connor Ruebusch. With me is Dr. Patrick Wyman. If you're looking for a good time with a pair of scofflaws, vagabonds, and all-around ruffians, please allow me to direct you to the co-main event podcast. This is Heavy Hands, and today we'll be talking about UFC 214 as well as some of the events surrounding it. UFC 214, of course, as you probably already know, an absolutely stacked, loaded, chock-full card. So much good stuff to talk about on it, especially as with UFC 213. The main card, the main event, is a rematch between Daniel Cormier, current UFC light heavyweight champion, and John Jones, who was stripped, I think, a little over 2 years ago now of his light heavyweight title. It feels like it's been ages. But we're going to be covering the main event next week, on next week's big, spectacular Heavy Hands episode. This week, we're going to get to some of the very important fights leading up to that, namely the welterweight title fight between defending champion Tyron Woodley and long-awaited challenger Demian Maia. That's going to be the first thing we discuss. After that, a women's featherweight scrap between questionable fan favorite, but certainly a star, Cristiane Cyborg-Giustino, and Invicta women's bantamweight champion, right? Tonya Evinger. Tonya Evinger is not a featherweight typically, is she?
No, she's the women's bantamweight champion. I'm not sure she's ever fought at featherweight.
Yeah, I'm not sure she has either. Short notice is probably the cause for the fact that she's fighting at featherweight this time. She is filling in for, remind me, Pat, who was originally intended to fight Cyborg?
Was supposed to be Megan Anderson, the Invicta women's featherweight champion. Instead, we get a sort of bizarre cross-promotion super fight. Certainly a match that I'm looking forward to. I have enjoyed every Tonya Evinger fight I've ever seen. She has a very unique charm to her, so to speak. So I'm looking forward to that one. Both Pat and I fan of the progression of Cyborg's career. Later on in today's episode, we're going to cover some events coming up, however, at this coming weekend's UFC card. It's a very, very busy schedule here in the middle of summer, and that is UFC, what are they going to call it? UFC Uniondale? UFC Long Island.
Long Island, there we go, that works. Or UFC on Fox 25. Sometimes they like to get the Fox title in there. That's main evented by middleweight contenders Chris Weidman and Weidman-Gastelum. Wouldn't it just be a fairy tale ending if former welterweight Weidman-Gastelum won this fight and earned himself a shot at new interim middleweight champion, former welterweight the Honorable Robert Knuckles. I think that would be a nice poetic ending, but Chris Weidman still has something to prove in the main event, and in addition to that, we're going to be talking about a bantamweight bout between Jimmy Rivera and Thomas Almeida, two extremely exciting fighters, a very thrilling matchup between two talented strikers, and at the very end of today's episode, we are going to cover in brief our favorite and most memorable results from last weekend's UFC card, UFC Glasgow, which was main evented by a shocking upset win of Santiago Ponzinibbio, who knocked out number 8 ranked contender Gunnar Nelson and Conor McGregor training partner in the first round. So lots of stuff to get to. Without any further preamble, let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing on the docket, Woodley versus Maia. It's even tripping me up. Let's go ahead and talk about the welterweight title fight. Tyron Woodley not exactly coming into this one with a ton of fan support, Pat.
Yeah, and understandably so. I mean, the first fight with Stephen Thompson, by virtue of a few really exciting moments, ended up being watchable, though I think it was more exciting at the time than it ended up being in hindsight. Like, I think it was fairly clear from the progression of that fight that the second fight between Woodley and Thompson was also going to be slow. And let me tell you, that is the worst fight I've ever seen live.
It was
because of it was just awful.
Rarely do I have a difficult time actually watching a fight. And I really did that. I remember being a little drunk while it was going on, so maybe that compromised my ability to pay attention, but I know I'm not alone in saying that I really wished I could have skipped through portions of that fight. There was genuinely nothing happening. No intent from either fighter, or at least no confidence. just long periods of both men waiting for the other to make the first big mistake, and neither of them willing enough to do anything to really make any mistakes. It was tedium. And you and I have both stood up for Tyron Woodley a lot in the past, but we've also spoken about the limitations in his style, right? The things that he's sort of accepted for himself, a gambit that is not always going to provide the fireworks that he wants. And I think we saw that in the Stephen Thompson fight with a perfect foil in Stephen Thompson, who was equally unwilling to put himself at risk. Woodley concerned about his stamina, Thompson concerned about getting knocked out, neither man doing anything. How about a matchup with Demian Maia? I mean, obviously, a lot of fan energy, I think, is going to be on the side of Demian Maia. It's really easy to root for him. He's 39 years old. He has always been the kindest, most respectful guy in MMA, and he's been waiting a long, long time for a shot at the title. He's currently riding a 7-fight win streak in the welterweight division, including his last, a very close win over Jorge Masvidal. What do you like about the matchup overall, my friend?
Well, I think we're going to find out a lot more about Woodley in this fight than we've learned from the past two fights with Stephen Thompson. I mean, it seems weird. Like, we've seen 50 minutes of Woodley since he knocked out Robbie Lawler, and I feel like what we have seen in that stretch has not been especially compelling. I think this is if it turns out that he can go out there and do 25 minutes of non-compelling stuff against Demian Maia, then you're going to be fair in writing him off. But I don't think that's what we're going to get. With that said, there's a lot of variation in terms of how this fight could play out. Because at the most basic level, it's a brick-fisted wrestler with outstanding takedown defense against a guy who really needs to get him to the ground to win the fight. So that's Maia's challenge, is can he get Woodley down? And if he can, what can he do in that period of time? That's the fundamental challenge. Now, for Woodley has a couple of different ways that he can go about trying to prevent that basic thing from happening. He can try to pressure and get after Maia. I think that's actually his best tack here. I think he should, rather than trying to maintain the distance, I think he should be perfectly willing to go after Maia and throw at him. Because as long as you're in open space, a wrestler of Woodley's caliber should be able to stuff Maia's takedowns. It's only when his back hits the fence that Woodley is going to be in real trouble trying to chain wrestle with Demian Maia. So that's my basic take here.
My read on Tyron Woodley is that he is, I mean, I think his greatest fear, and this has been corroborated by some people that know him, is gassing. I think he really has that Joe Rogan narrative running in his head at all times when he's fighting. That he's a big muscular guy. He throws with tons of power. He's super explosive. He's kind of like, the sort of facets we discussed about like Conor McGregor and Amanda Nunes when we talked about her a couple weeks ago. He has those elements, and I think he's really worried about succumbing to that. And personally, I think I won't really be fully satisfied with a Tyron Woodley performance until I see some sign, some clear indication that he's willing to get tired. Like, I think that's when we're going to actually see the best of Tyron Woodley, is him being willing to get a little tired, because I know Tyron Woodley has a second and third wind in him. I know he can, fight slowly and take a portion of a fight off to recover. I think the fact that he's so tentative at times about letting some of his precious energy stores go has convinced him that they won't come back once they're gone. And that, I think, is what he would need, that acceptance to pressure Demian Maia. If he does it, I think he's basically a lock to win this fight. I think Maia's going to have a really hard time beating a Tyron Woodley who comes after him, who puts himself in range, who actively pursues the knockout and the takedown and the cage control. Because what flashes of pressure and aggression we've seen from Woodley, little glimpses after he hurt Stephen Thompson in their first fight, little moments against Kelvin Gastelum.
When he went after Robbie Lawler.
Of course, Robbie Lawler. Whom he ran
impressive.
Into a right hand against the fence. He pressured him into the fence to land that shot. It makes, Woodley has his very passive style to lull you into range for his power shots, to surprise you with his speed because you get overconfident. How much better for him to use that speed to put you in a trap that you are literally not physically capable of escaping from. that you just can't move fast enough to get away because you're cornered, and he moves faster and throws with more power than just about anyone else in the division. So,
yeah, and there are a couple of aspects to that, though, right? Like because then we can. These are not necessarily to be read as criticisms of Tyron Woodley, but like I think it's kind of constructive stuff in directions that maybe we would like to see him go.
Yeah,
is he would not need to worry so much about gassing if he had a better command of rhythm. Right? Like, if he were just willing to toss out some half-speed strikes from time to time. Like,
fake volume.
That's exactly it. Fake volume. It's what Yoel Romero does a lot of, right? Like, I think Romero is kind of the poster child for how to be an effective low-volume fighter. And the way that Romero does that is by feinting a lot and by reaching out and touching you a lot and by making it seem like he's doing a lot of things. But when Romero's fastball comes, it comes faster than you think it does because he's been throwing out those tapping strikes and he's been measuring distance, engaging things. And when Woodley gets himself into trouble, as he did against Thompson, it's generally because he's not doing that stuff. He's not jabbing. He's not reaching out to touch you. He's not measuring distance. So when he throws, it has to be a huge burst of energy because he doesn't know exactly where you are. He can't exactly gauge it. So he has to throw everything in there just to be sure that he gets to you.
Right. He can't afford to throw a 75% power shot because the only method he has to land those shots, the only method he's willing to rely on is sheer shock at the speed with which he attacks. Yeah, exactly. I often think the example I always think of is Mike McCallum, one of my favorite boxers. Lord forgive me for making what now sounds like a comparison between Mike McCallum and this next man, but you could also look at Nick Diaz. These are guys who, if you were to just count the shots into which they put potentially fight-ending power, if you were to only count those blows, they'd be low-volume strikers. And a key to their success is that they are so willing to put volume out there that really only serves to make it easier to land the low output of actually powerful strikes. Mike McCallum had a pawing jab. He was constantly touching, constantly sort of playing with your guard and probing. Nick Diaz obviously does the same thing with his combinations. Both guys renowned for their body punching. Maybe this comparison is stronger than I thought. But Tyron Woodley doesn't have that. He's not willing to have it. And I think it would make it so much easier for him if he was feeding himself information without burning energy. And that would, in turn, maybe give him the impression that, like, I can do things without getting tired. You know, I can be active and controlling the fight. I can make the fight I want without burning all my energy at once.
And you don't even need to go that far afield for examples. You can look at guys with whom Woodley has spent a lot of time training. Yoel Romero. Robbie Lawler is a great example of this.
Yeah.
Like Robbie Lawler, when he was on that outstanding run, did a great job of just touching. Right? Just touch, gather information, set a rhythm. And that's something I talked to Lawler about just before he fought Rory McDonald. We talked about rhythm. And he's like, yeah, you know, it just took me a long time to learn it. And it's just one of those time things. But he had clearly thought about that and thought about how he was going to do it. And like, it's a situation where Woodley, that more than anything else, would make Woodley drastically more effective.
Yeah,
if
and
you just learn to touch and set a rhythm.
Even Zach Cummings, who Tyron Woodley brought in to train for Robbie Lawler. I know he has a relationship with Zach Cummings. He knows how to do that pretty well, too. He does some touching and some feeling. He also is actually a very low-output fighter who has to set up his shots because he's not quite as fast as Tyron Woodley. I just think Woodley has... We both accept the fact as analysts that this is like a stylistic limitation in a sense, but I think we both also know there's some room for evolution there, and that Woodley needs to sort of accept or open his mind a bit to the potential of his style, the potential of the athleticism, the power, the speed that he does have, along with, of course, that incredible wrestling skill, which we so rarely see used aggressively. So against Demian Maia, I tend to agree with your outlook on the matchup. We know that Maia is a phenomenal grappler. It may be difficult to out-wrestle Woodley, and also difficult to out-grapple him on the ground until he gets tired. Woodley may be able to scramble free. But you'd have to imagine that Maia needs takedowns to make this fight his. And to do that, he's probably going to have to survive some pretty nasty shots from Woodley if Woodley is active enough to throw. But I suspect he will be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of an interesting fight because both guys need to worry about their gas tanks. Like Maia is not exactly a cardio machine, you know? Yep. But what we know about Maia as opposed to Woodley is that Maia can still win a fight when he's gassed. Mm-hmm. If he can drag you into his world, it doesn't matter how tired Maia is because he's going to figure out ways to make that work no matter how exhausted he gets. So, like, there's a real sense of a fight here where where Maia tries and fails to get takedowns in the first 2 rounds and is just absolutely exhausted. But in defending those takedowns, he has managed to gas out Woodley, and starting around the midway point of round 3, he just sucks Woodley into this kind of like god-awful grinding fight against the fence and on the mat where it's takedown here, ankle pick there, deep half to a single leg there, chain. Maia gets Woodley's back, Woodley survives, and you end up with this like 48-47 split decision of a fight where, like, I think that's a real possibility for how this could play out if Maia doesn't get his head taken off.
Yeah, and some evidence for that kind of fight. When is the last time that Tyron Woodley has gassed? Like has you know what I mean? I'm looking at his record, and it occurs to me that what holds Tyron Woodley back, what seems to cause a lot of his losses or his unremarkable wins, is that he won't let himself gas. When's the last time that Tyron Woodley has actually gotten to the point that he's exhausted, and that's a big part of the reason that he loses? Was it the Nate Marquardt fight?
No, it was the Rory McDonald fight. But that was mostly Rory making him tired, especially with body work.
Yeah, and him and his unwillingness to put energy out there, allowing Rory to fight that fight because Woodley just kept backing himself into the fence and waiting.
Yeah, so I don't know. He didn't really gas in the Shields fight, did he?
No, he just really didn't. It looked like a fight where he really didn't want to gas, and so he really didn't do anything.
Well, but he threw a lot in the Shields fight. He landed like 65 strikes. Like that was by far his
Wasn't it all like
volume.
clinch knees and stuff like that though?
No, he like whacked Shields at range with a whole bunch of strikes. Like he really put volume out there. It was that was a terrible decision. I'm trying to think the last time he really gassed. I think the McDonald fight was the one that did it to him mentally because you could see before that the outlines of like a much more consistently effective.
True, because he was quite aggressive, like low volume, but quite aggressive in the Carlos Condit fight, closing the distance and setting up his shots. And then the Rory McDonald fight, it's like he wanted that and then had it forced out of him by the McDonald fight. I think you may be onto something there, but that's the thing is. You feel like Woodley should win this fight. I mean, like he's fighting an old man, and he's extremely powerful and is really technically not a bad fighter at all. Like in any area, he can do a lot of different things. He's got quite a deep skill set. He just seems to hold himself back, maybe because of some ghost in his past, and maybe that ghost comes in the shape of Rory McDonald. Who knows? But let's wrap up with picks. How do you think that those limitations will affect Woodley in the fight, and how do you see it playing out?
I feel like if only for durability and age reasons and athleticism reasons, you have to take Woodley here. That's going to be my pick. But with the caveat that I really see how Maia wins this fight. Like, I think Woodley melts him in the first or the second round with a right hand and some follow-up ground strikes. But I really see how Maia could drag this into being a very Maia kind of fight and either finishes him with a submission or grinds out the last like 2.5 or 3 rounds to win it.
Yeah, so I can't escape this. I mean, I feel like that's the right pick. I can't escape this feeling that Woodley needs to be better than the Rory McDonald fight. And, he needs to be the improved version of the guy who went to that fight. He needs to be the kind of guy who could have won that matchup to beat Maia over 5 rounds. And the Stephen Thompson fight suggests that he's not. But certain bouts, like the Kelvin Gastelum fight, we see signs of improvement post-Rory McDonald. I don't know. I think it's a matter of who seizes the confidence early on, basically.
Woodley is a better... let's stop real quick, because Woodley is a better fighter than he was. He just doesn't do as much.
Yeah,
His his punching mechanics are better. His footwork is better. Mm-hmm. I think his takedown game is better suited to what he's actually trying to do. His top game is certainly better. I think there are a lot of things that you can point to when you're like, yes, this is a better fighter. But he just doesn't do as many things as he did. And so the question is, can a better technical fighter, but one who doesn't do as many things, be a championship caliber guy?
Yeah, man.
I mean, he's the champion. He's now technically speaking, he's defended his title twice. Like,
yeah, that's the thing is, Woodley is, I don't think Woodley's a bad fighter at all. I still feel like there's a lot of reason to stick up for him and say, here are the things he does well. He's just frustrating, because he's got such a style that has so many clear limitations, and it's not obvious how to solve them. And so it's just a frustrating question all the time. I'm going to go with
He's not actually that long into his career, though. This is a wild thing. Despite the fact that he's 35, he's only been fighting as a professional for 8 years.
Yeah, that's true. So,
he's taken basically no damage in his career. He's not had to deal with a lot of major injuries over that time.
So look, right around the time of the Weidman-Gastelum fight is where I would have expected a fighter like Tyron Woodley to really show what he's capable of. And we at least, I think, saw some glimpses of it in that fight. I mean, that fight got a lot of boos. Gastelum was overweight. Yeah, but right. I thought Woodley looked pretty good. He showed some defense. He showed a little bit of pressure, a little bit of outside footwork. I thought he looked pretty solid. It was like Curtis Blades' win over Daniel Omielanchuk. It was not the barn burner anybody wanted, but it was a meaningful fight for Tyron Woodley if you were like a matchmaker watching him develop. But then we had the Stephen Thompson fight, the rematch after that in the timeline. And so is that just Stephen Thompson as like the perfect bad fight foil? I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say that when he's not fighting Stephen Thompson, Tyron Woodley is still capable of building on the improvements he has clearly been making, and that Demian Maia maybe just has too limited a path to victory for me to pick him. Although if he gets Woodley into a passive type of fight, Demian Maia absolutely could get the win. And God knows I'll be happy to see it because I'm a big fan of Demian Maia's. But Tyron Woodley too. So tough fight to call. Might be a bit of a tough fight to watch. Only time will tell. Both of us going for Tyron Woodley to retain his title. Let's quickly get into our second fight from UFC 214 for this week's episode before breaking off, and we'll finish this discussion in segment 2. Let's talk about the women's featherweight scrap. Christiane Cyborg Justino is taking on women's bantamweight champion from Invicta, Tonya Evinger.
This is about as good a fight as I think the UFC could come up with for Cyborg on short notice.
Yeah.
Given that Megan Anderson was forced to pull out a few weeks ago. Tonya Evinger is awesome, man. Like if you're an MMA fan, you don't love Tonya Evinger, just fuck right off. Like she's fantastic. She is the epitome of the grimy, grindy wrestle boxer. She's got a hell of a personality on her. Like you got to love Tonya Evinger, man.
She really leans into this like the style as personality idea, doesn't she?
I mean, she looks like she'd fuck someone up in a Walmart parking lot.
Yeah,
and like and she has. Like that's the thing that Tonya Evinger has done. Like somebody said that to Julie Kedzie on Twitter, like maybe a year and a half ago, and Julie was like, "No, she fought people in Walmart parking lots. That's a thing that she's done."
I love that Evinger. She's well known, of course, for vomiting after fights, often in the midst of post-fight interviews. And I love the idea that, like, that's probably a problem that could be solved if only she weren't drinking, like, Leinenkugel's Summer Shandy in the corner instead of water. You know what I mean? Like, she's just drinking, like, some relatively cheap summer beer. You just get that vibe from Tonya Evinger. Not to fall into our racial stereotypes of blue-collar and hardworking, but like I said, Evinger herself really leaned into that feel.
Yeah, I mean, Evinger is one of this sport's great personalities, and frankly, I mean, in a sport full of fighters who love women, I think that Evinger might love women the most. Like this is a sport full of hounds.
Tonya Evinger, horniest fighter in the game.
Yeah, I mean, she is thirsty, and her thirst game is strong because she is out there on every social media platform hunting. Yeah, like it is wild.
She's awesome.
But anyway, as far as a fight goes, I expect Cyborg to win this, but I think it's an interesting matchup because Evinger has the takedown game and top game and durability and cardio to challenge Cyborg if this gets out of the first couple of rounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, particularly when you consider that Cyborg's longest fight in recent memory was about with... Like, it was long because it lasted more than a few minutes in the first round. But her fight with Daria Ibrahimova from Invicta 15, she spent a long portion of that fight chipping away with right hands. She was the one landing and doing damage, but she was stuck in a single leg position against the fence. And if Tonya Evinger can force those kinds of positions where, yes, she probably is still going to be taking shots because Cyborg is so strong and has such good balance and, can not load up at all on a right-handed arm punch and still do actual damage. But that's the kind of damage that Evinger can take. And if she can get Cyborg to that range and control her in that clinch for long enough, and I think she does have a chance of working this into the kind of fight that she can win. If she gets stuck out at range, if Cyborg continues to flash some of that nice footwork and distance management, all of Tonya Evinger's greatness will probably not be enough to save her from a pretty typical Cyborg result. The only thing maybe that's different from other Cyborg opponents is that Evinger is, of course, famously very tough and durable. But that so's Leslie Smith, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Evinger is going to come after Cyborg, too.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's if Cyborg is good off her back foot, but she likes to be the one who sets the terms under which exchanges happen.
Yeah.
And if Evinger can push her back and pressure her and, force Cyborg to operate exclusively off the back foot, then it becomes an interesting kind of matchup in that regard. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Cyborg is too big, too strong, too mean, and too technically sound on the feet. But there is a real path to victory for Evinger if she can survive. If she can survive, if she can force a few of those really good exchanges, and most of all, if she can take the initiative away from Cyborg. I think that's the really important thing. Like, Cyborg is a fighter who thrives when she is dictating the terms of engagement. And if Evinger can take that away from her, then it becomes really interesting. Yeah,
you don't necessarily have to withstand all of Cyborg's physical strength if you can knock her out of the driver's seat, basically. That you can basically mitigate the circumstances in which her size and strength and power are effective. And then you don't have to deal with them as much as long as she's not controlling the initiative of the fight. I agree. I think that's Evinger's path to victory here. She is a grimy fighter. She does come forward. I won't be surprised at all if she wins that battle, and I think she may tie Cyborg up. But even in the kind of fight she wants, Evinger is rarely running away with the match. You know, she's been more or less undefeated for quite some time. She lost that fight to Yana Kunitskaya, but was quickly overturned to a no contest because of referee interference, basically. And other than that, she's undefeated since 2011. She's really turned a corner, but her fights are still not easy. We've seen her go to the fourth round with Reina Aldana. She's gone to the second round several times. She went to the fifth round recently with Colleen Schneider. There's still scrappy fights in which she and her opponent are exchanging techniques for many of the rounds, and that I just don't see that being the kind of fight she can confidently win against Cyborg. Like, you just can't give Cyborg that many moments.
Yeah, and frankly, Cyborg has, despite the fact that, Cyborg looks like she should be exhausted with the way that she fights, Cyborg's in real good shape.
Oh, yeah.
She is a well-conditioned fighter. Cyborg, I think, probably does about as much road work as anybody in MMA. She runs about 50 miles a week.
Yeah, we have to say, as far as we know, because the last time we've seen her go any considerable distance was a rematch with Marlos Kunin in 2013, but if that fight is any indication, and I suspect it is, she went to the fourth round without difficulty. I think Marlos Kunin was also hoping to wear her down and get to a part where she could actually start winning rounds and winning exchanges, and she never really got there. Despite a really great effort, she still got shellacked in that fourth round, and it ultimately gave Cyborg a chance to show off the full depth of her game. Cyborg got to show off her wrestling and her ground and pound and her guard passing, in addition to the fearsome kickboxing we all know and love. So yeah, I just think there's the window of opportunity, the path to victory, however you want to phrase it metaphorically, it's too narrow to count on Tonya Evinger in this fight. I like Cyborg to get it done via TKO. I'm thinking second or third round. She may find the opening she needs.
Yeah, I think so. I think it'll look like a more violent version of her of the fight with Lena Landsberg.
Sure.
Lena Landsberg. I think we'll see a lot of kind of grimy clinching early.
Yeah.
But even then, I don't think that's a fight that Evinger has a great shot in. Cyborg's too big, too strong, hits too hard. Probably Cyborg by second round KO is the favorite here.
Feels like
maybe third round.
We'll be waiting for Cyborg, and not waiting too long, for Cyborg to find the right opening in Evinger's kind of fight. But I think it's still a fight that she wins. So let's take one break, and when we come back from this, we are going to be able to move on with a little skip in our step to UFC Long Island, we were calling it. Boy, I lost it again. UFC on Fox 25. We're going to talk about the main event there, Chris Weidman versus Kelvin-Gastelum, and also that bantamweight thriller between Jimmy Rivera and Thomas Almeida. I'm really looking forward to both of those, especially the bantamweight fight, actually. Bantamweight is where it's at these days, and we'll talk about both of those after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's go ahead and talk about that middleweight fight. Chris Weidman not having the success that many had expected from him after he won the middleweight title from Anderson Silva way back in 2013. It has been quite a while. Lost the belt in a sort of strange bout to Luke Rockhold, and is now riding a 3-fight losing streak. Of course, all top fighters, Luke Rockhold, Yoel Romero, Gegard Mousasi, all bona fide middleweight contenders in the top 5, basically, but also all knockouts for a guy who's always kind of been known for his toughness and durability, and has been in some wars that, his condition these days looks like if he'd had him now, he wouldn't end up surviving them. And he's taking on Kelvin-Gastelum in this fight, who is resurgent in the middleweight division. Has had his problems at welterweight, mostly centering around making weight, but a couple of actual losses as well where he didn't quite deliver. Really seems to be finding his footing as a fighter at 185. And, to me, Pat, I'll just say it out front, I don't have a good feeling for Chris Weidman. Even though I think it would be a mistake to overlook him in this fight, or to assume that it's a foregone conclusion that he loses, it is hard to look at his career and feel much in the way of positive momentum.
Yeah, and I think stylistically this could be real tough for him too. Mm-hmm. The Weidman had a reputation early in his career as a guy who could go deep into fights, and who could control the pace and who worked fast. I think that we saw that especially when he fought Woodley-Maia, where he just kind of gutted through a terrible weight cut and still produced quite a bit of volume in like a really tough, grimy fight. And you thought like, oh man, this is just a guy who can fight anybody and not get that tired. And what we've seen from him over the last few fights is a guy who gasses bad. He gassed against Machida in what is probably his last like really great performance. He gassed badly against Luke Rockhold. He gassed he was gassed by like the third round against Luke Rockhold, despite the fact that he was fighting a guy who wasn't working that fast and wasn't throwing a ton of volume. And I mean it was weird that he gassed in that fight. He gassed badly against Gegard Mousasi. He didn't really gas against Romero, but that fight was glacially slow paced.
Yeah, and I think he still was noticeably more tired than Romero in round 3. I mean, I thought about midway through round 2, I noticed that that was when Romero started to hit takedowns and out-scramble Weidman. There was a little less speed from a guy who has already not have a great baseline of speed, but even his explosions, which we've covered many times, they're usually surprisingly quick. We're not really there compared to Romero's. Now, some of that is probably, the fact that he was in there with Yoel Romero. It's hard for anyone to match him for explosion, but I did still think that basically in all three of Weidman's last 3 losses, we've seen 3 TKOs, 3 failures of a once great chin, and also 3 occasions of him slowing down noticeably quicker than he should.
The Mousasi one was the really bad one because he was working, but he wasn't working that hard.
No.
If you are a championship caliber fighter, you should be able to maintain the pace that Weidman was pushing in the first round and a half against Mousasi for at least 20 minutes.
And he had almost as good a first 3 or 4 minutes as could have been expected from this matchup. I mean, he obviously took some shots, obviously had some scrambles that he didn't outright win, but he was controlling most of the early portion, was doing really well with his takedowns.
That was exactly the fight he wanted.
Just like against Romero, it seemed like he had a very clear process in mind. And they say, that you reach this state when you get tired where your mind still knows what to do, but your body just won't listen. And Weidman reached that point very quickly. The fight showed early on that he knew where he was headed. He knew what he was supposed to do. But, man, once Mousasi found a little bit of momentum, the rug was taken out from under Weidman's feet so quickly. It really caught me off guard. Even though I'd seen him slow down, he really just became a target.
Well, the gassing was exactly why he got finished in that fight.
Yeah.
The knees were caused exactly by Weidman shooting being tired, hitting a bad level change, shooting from too far outside, getting caught in a front headlock, and then getting kneed. It was a direct consequence of him getting tired.
Yeah, and sort of accepting a gamesman position, which was not really advantageous, but for, some shakiness on the part of the rules. The only reason Weidman allowed himself to take those knees in that position is because I think he was too tired to scramble out of it.
Mm-hmm. So if he gassed against Gegard Mousasi and he was tired against Romero and he gassed against Luke Rockhold, what's he going to do against a guy who's perfectly willing to throw 18 or 20 shots a minute?
Yeah. Who really fights at a clip, has a lot of speed and power, and is accurate. Yeah.
That's the worry here. And I think Weidman has passed the victory here. This is not like a hopeless fight for him. He's not like either of us saying he should be a 10-1 underdog, especially because if he can get takedowns against Kelvin Gastelum and hold him down, he can absolutely submit Gastelum or win the fight. He has ways of doing that here. If he gets on top, his size advantage alone and sheer skill as a top player is going to be enough to at least take rounds, if not actually finish Gastelum from the top. That's a distinct possibility here. But if he can't get those takedowns, if he shoots fruitlessly, if he wastes energy, if he's tired by the midway point of the second round, Gastelum is going to fucking bury him in strikes.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, it's I don't even think that the reach disparity is too much of a factor here. I think Gastelum is quick enough and agile enough on the feet that he should be able to hang with Weidman even as his freshest at range. And I think that Weidman is big enough and skilled enough as a wrestler and grappler that his path to victory is to get Gastelum to the ground. But there is a lot more reason to expect Kelvin Gastelum to get the fight he wants than there is to expect it from Chris Weidman. I know Gastelum can take a shot. I know he can survive things going wrong in his kind of fight. Whereas Weidman, it seems to just take one straw these days, and the camel's back is in pieces. So it's just tough to count on him, man. I guess Weidman's becoming what Bloody Elbows Eugene Robinson would call a Gikta. A guy I can't trust anymore. And you might think that Gikt is worse than Gikta, guy I can't trust. But in fact, the ultimate version is guy I can't trust anymore. Mm-hmm. The days of trusting Chris Weidman may indeed be behind us.
Yeah, it's weird because Weidman was not a guy I was initially that high on. If we were talking about elite middleweight prospects of 2010 and 2011, I thought Rockhold was the guy. Yeah. And that Rockhold was going to be the one to be a long-term champion. I thought Weidman was fine, but I thought he was fringy top 5 and not the guy who's going to rule everything forever. And I did, and like it's weird to be strangely vindicated about that, like that Weidman has run up against trouble against all of these other elite middleweights. I did not think it would be this shocking though, and like this dramatic.
Yeah. And that let's take a few moments just to mention the matchmaking here. Who is running Chris Weidman's career? Because I know, like, if a couple years ago, if after that Luke Rockhold fight we said he's taking on Kelvin Gastelum, we wouldn't have said that's crazy. But taking on Kelvin Gastelum, who has now looked great at middleweight after 3 straight knockout losses, I just feel like if there's anything left to be salvaged of Chris Weidman, this isn't the way to find it. You're not going to use the method you used to get him the title and put him under duress and watch him come through with flying colors. I think he needs a break. You know, I think Chris Weidman needs a tune-up, and they're just not willing to give it to him, or he's not willing to take one, whatever the cause. I'm a little worried about the matchmaking here. Like, I think it might end his career.
A combination of all that. Like,
yeah.
I think for what they're paying him, and I think they're paying him a pretty substantial amount of money, it's hard to justify putting him in there with a Rafael Natal or Krzysztof Jotko or something like that. I mean, so I think there's that. I think also there's the sense in Weidman's camp that, like, he's 32, 33. Mm-hmm. Like, he's not done. He's still a relatively young guy. He should be in the prime of his career.
Yeah, but he looks done, you know? He looks at least dangerously close to done in that last fight, man. It looked bad.
The way he was talking after the knees from Mousasi when Joe Rogan was interviewing him after that fight, mm-hmm. like, that's one of the few times I've ever been listening to a fighter in that situation and I've been like, are you okay?
Yeah.
Like existentially, not in the like, yeah, you just lost a fight by TKO way. The like, is there something deeply wrong here? Kind of ways. I don't know. Like, I don't want to be an alarmist about it, and I'm sure once we say that, people will say that we're being alarmist or weird or what have you. But like, I've seen a lot of fighters give a lot of interviews. I've watched a lot of guys' careers from beginning to end, and that is not how Chris Weidman used to talk.
Sometimes you get a feeling, man. Like, sometimes you watch you gather enough material that you watch somebody kind of blinking weirdly, or someone slurring their speech, or somebody sort of crazily fixating on one small detail of a recent loss or whatever it may be, and you're like, that is not something that they should have to carry around with them. Something is wrong here. So, yeah, we'll see. I like Kelvin Gastelum. I think second-round TKO seems to fit the bill with what's been happening to Chris lately, and I think Gastelum is just as capable as Gegard Mousasi of making it happen. What about you?
Yeah. I think it looks a lot like the Kennedy fight does. I think Weidman is going to get a takedown or two early on, but Gastelum has real strong hips. He's so stocky, it's hard to maintain underhooks. It's hard to keep it. He's squirrely. It's kind of hard to keep him down. He's a good natural scrambler and a good trained scrambler too. I think he's now coming into his own as a Rafael Cordeiro pressure fighter. Like, by the time everything's said and done with Gastelum, I think he ends up looking like a better version of the Rafael dos Anjos who ran through the lightweight division.
Sure, yeah.
Like, I think that's the kind of path his skill sets will take. And that, at this point, something we didn't even mention here, but, like, from a purely stylistic perspective, Weidman is best when he is barreling forward as a pressure fighter, and he reacts terribly when he's put on the back foot. Mm-hmm. Gastelum is going to put him on the back foot starting about halfway through the first round. And once that happens, this strikes me as a real snowball rolling downhill kind of fight.
Yeah, and I think if Weidman works his takedowns, like, we may see him coming forward at the very start, but I think Gastelum is skilled enough and certainly quick enough that he can land a big crunching shot, something to change Weidman's mind, or something to at least keep him from running away with the fight until he gets tired. And that tendency to exhaust himself these days, that to me is the most worrying thing about Chris Weidman. It's the thing that has most clearly bitten him and exposed what seems to be a less durable chin than it used to be. So, yeah, I think the Kennedy fight, except imagine Kennedy got really tired in round 2. I really think that's what we're going to see. So I'm liking, Gastelum. Let's move on then. Jimmy Rivera, Tomas Almeida. Rivera has talked a big game and made a case for himself as a top contender. Ran away with an easy, if not spectacular, win over Uriah Faber back in 2016, and then upset some people who refused to take a meaningless fight basically on short notice in the interim. I think he was scheduled since then to take on Brian Caraway. That fell through in January, and he didn't want to fight Marlon Vera. Some people said that was a cowardly decision or something. I can't possibly find it in me to criticize him for not taking a fight that gives him no further momentum. His patience has paid off. Now he takes on fan favorite and action fighter Tomas Almeida in a fight that I think really could decide, basically could thrust somebody into a number one contenders type of fight. So what's your take on it?
This is a fantastic matchup.
Yeah.
And I think this is the fight where we figure out whether Almeida is a legit contender or whether he's just like one of the all-time great action fighters.
Yeah.
Because if he's the Albert Morales fight, his first after being just fucking flatlined by Cody Garbrandt, Almeida did not make the kinds of changes you would think that he would need to make to have more longevity with his career or to compete against more elite fighters. Like, he got hit by Morales in the same kind of ways as he's been getting hit beforehand, and not really showing a lot in the way of like flexibility, I guess. Like, he's kind of a swarmer, and that's really what he wants to do. And he hasn't shown much in the way of tactical or strategic flexibility. And I don't think that like swarming Jimmy Rivera, it could work. Like, it's not impossible that he gets into a swarming kind of brawl with Rivera and beats him in that kind of fight.
Yeah.
But like,
Rivera's not Garbrandt. He's not quite that dangerous.
Yeah, but it would be nice if Almeida were showing a little bit more in the way of range with his skills.
Yeah, I think an interesting wrinkle to this strategically is that, based on what I've seen, Almeida is a slow starter who doesn't know that he maybe should start slow. Sort of the position that Santiago Ponzinibbio has also put himself in at times. Speaking of the man who won last weekend, Almeida, I think, he's mentally a slow starter, and he wants to start at a fast pace. And we've touched on that a few times over the years that he's been in the UFC, but he tends to throw himself right into these exchanges before he's really comfortable enough or informed enough by the actions of the opponent to keep himself safe. So he's just really throwing himself into the fire from the get-go, and tends to get used to those exchanges as the fight goes on, tends to become a really clean, technical, and pretty hard to hit pressure fighter later in the fight. It's only early that he tends to get hurt. And then you compare that to Jimmy Rivera. I think Jimmy Rivera might be a bit of a fast starter. I think we've seen, there have been some circumstances that have changed the way he's had to fight. Uriah Faber poked him in the eye really badly. Pedro Munoz staged a hell of a comeback.
Faber dug deep into the bag of nasty veteran tricks in order to try to slow Rivera's roll in that fight, and did a pretty good job of it.
Yeah,
all things considered.
But in each of his UFC fights, except for the first round KO over Marcus Brimage, we have seen Rivera accept the closest round of the fight in the third, and do really well and surprise his opponent with just his technical acumen and his triggers in the first round. And so to me,
that's the key thing. It's how quick his triggers are right away. Like, he doesn't need time to get he doesn't need like you to show him a whole lot to get your timing. Like, you throw something at him and he is keyed in on that and ready to go, which I think speaks to really good game planning and training. Like, he's a drilled counterpuncher in addition to being a pretty good natural one.
Yeah, he's naturally, I think, very quick and like compact, good in scrambly sort of things, and also good in exchanges. Like, it's difficult to outreact him, but he's clearly also has those reactions trained into him. Has clearly done some serious pad drilling, some serious partner drilling, because you'll see right from the get-go, somebody will show him 3 jabs, and the fourth time they even think about flashing their jab, a right hand's meeting them over the top, followed quickly by a left hook, followed by a right uppercut in case they manage to duck under the left hook. Like, the counters come intelligently and in layers with surprising speed.
He's the rarest of birds, I think, in all of combat sports, which is a dyed-in-the-wool, from-the-ground-up counterpuncher.
Yeah.
Like, that is so uncommon to be that kind of guy. It's not like he counters it's not like counters are just a part of his arsenal or a thing that he does the way they are for, like, Cody Garbrandt is a good counterpuncher. Like Chris Cyborg is a good counterpuncher. Like, there are a lot of good counterpunchers out there. There are not many where that's the entire basis of their game and that reflects itself in some way in their ground up approach to the fight. Like, because from the ground up, counterpunchers tend to throw way more volume. They're not looking to pick you off a shot or two at a time. They're looking for triggers, and then they're going to get their offense off.
Yeah.
And that's Rivera. Like, he doesn't just throw one shot. He throws 2, 3, 4 shots. His triggers are right there from the opening bell of the fight. But he's not like, it's interesting. Your point about the third round is a good one. And that makes me kind of wonder if my initial read on this Almeida fight was maybe a little off. Like, if we get into the second and the third round, because Almeida is the opposite. Almeida is an organic counterpuncher. Like, he picks up on things as the fight goes on, and then he becomes a devastating counterpuncher.
Yeah.
As Rivera shows him more, and as Almeida figures out what Rivera's triggers are, then this fight becomes really, really interesting. If Almeida can survive and not get blown out of the water in the first 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, and I think Rivera's very tactical. He's a tactical wizard. Like, I don't think he gets enough respect for how good he is making tactical decisions. But I think what ends up happening to him, why he feels like a fast starter and a slow finisher, is that he ends up getting strategically outmaneuvered by his opponents. So he needs almost no time at all to figure out how to land the right hand over their jab. But if they make it far enough, which most of them do, to learn that maybe they don't have to throw the jab from that range, and then maybe they'll take this range instead, and maybe they'll try this different set of tools, that Rivera's, his build and his boxing specialty and everything, it kind of limits him a little more. He certainly still has some flexibility. Like, I think his fight with Uriah Faber looked in some ways like Edson Barboza's fight with Anthony Pettis, where even if there was finally an adjustment made en route to the third round, Almeida, like Barboza, had still found another weapon with which to control the remainder of the fight. For Rivera, for both men, it was low kicks, and they had opened those up through the success they had with their hands earlier. But the question here is, if we accept that is the way Rivera fights, that he can be strategically outmaneuvered and outworked, the question is Tomas Almeida's style, is the sort of aggression he brings, the kind of strategy, because I think we have a clear idea of what strategy Almeida will either choose or end up falling into, is that the kind of strategy which will beat Rivera? Because it's not as if Almeida's going to give Rivera fewer and fewer opportunities as the fight goes on. He's going to keep giving him more. So the question is, can he overload the computer that is Rivera's brain? Can he feed him too much information and do so while surviving what comes back from Rivera?
Yeah, because Rivera is a hard puncher. He's a real good, clean, hard puncher.
He's not Garbrandt, like I said, but I think he's not maybe a great finisher, but he definitely carries power. And a lot of his fights have been slow because the opponents quickly become extremely wary of his hands.
Yeah, and I don't think that that's going to be Almeida. So I guess, like, my initial read on this fight was either a Rivera knockout or a clean Rivera decision. I still think Rivera wins this, but I think it could get real interesting as we get into the last 3 or 4 minutes of the fight. If Almeida can back him up to the fence and really start digging into his combination game, it could be really interesting. Almeida's a guy whose career I've followed since literally the very beginning. He is since 2012, I think, was the first time I saw Almeida fight. And I was convinced that he was going to be great, like great. I'm less convinced that he's going to be great, but I think he's going to be a really tough out for everybody but the very best fighters in this division. And I guess this is going to be a real test of Rivera's ability to adjust and get through that, I think.
Yeah, and I'm not ready to give up on Almeida just yet. Like, I think he's had a long stretch at the beginning of his career with no defeats. It may have just taken him a while to get to his prospect losses, and now we're going to see him really fine-tune and find the final form of his style. And he's only 25. He's been fighting for a while, but I think he still has potential to show something. And if he wins here, it could be by showing that. I think maybe a third-round TKO for Almeida, or even a decision where he has to gut out a tough first round. Both of those are possible. I think it's also possible that Rivera keeps him on the back foot a little more than he would like, or hurts him so badly in the first much like Cody Garbrandt, that he gets a knockout. I think both of those are very reasonable possibilities. But I do think we've got an interesting, well-matched fight, and either way, even if it is a blowout for Rivera, Almeida's the kind of guy who's going to bring the best out of him. He's going to give us those sudden, unexpected triggers, those beautiful counter combinations. And then out of Rivera, we're going to get to see somebody who has the footwork and the defense and the counter punching to force Almeida to go to the next level of swarming and pressure fighting, to really fight in lots and lots of layers himself. So I'm very excited for it. It's a fight I've been looking forward to since they announced it. I was hyped when they announced this fight. If you want to know more information about Jimmy Rivera in particular, and if you want to hear him talk shit about TJ Dillashaw, you should check out the interview on our Patreon. I did like an hour-long talk with Jimmy a few months ago for a written article, and the entire audio from our interview is up on our Patreon for $3 subscribers, the same as any other bonus content. And we basically just talked about training, about his sparring session he had with TJ Dillashaw a couple years ago, about where he stands in the division, where his style comes from, and lots of other interesting tidbits on his personal and fighting life. So if you, like us, think that Jimmy Rivera winning is even slightly the most likely outcome, then you should go check that out. I think you might find that interesting. Pat, anything else to add before we move on to segment 3?
No,
All right, let's wrap things up with UFC Long Island, and we will move on to our recap of last week's card, UFC Glasgow, the main event between Santiago Ponzinibbio and Gunnar Nelson, and more after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And here we are. Let's go ahead and get into UFC Glasgow's main event, welterweight Santiago Ponzinibbio and Gunnar Nelson. Pat, I'm going to let you take the lead on this one, because I know people are probably not, especially a lot of the fans that Gunnar Nelson used to have acquired, are probably not looking forward to me talking about his loss too much.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's that much to take from it, like in terms of like, oh my God, there's something really wrong with Gunnar Nelson. No, this is Nelson's game. Like he tends to throw single shots. He tends to look for single shots into takedowns. He's kind of amorphous in what he's trying to do out there, and he's always been hittable. Look at his fight metric numbers. He's about a 50% defensive fighter, which means, and he relies almost entirely on angles and distance to avoid getting hit. That's if you're fighting a skilled combination puncher and you get your back put on the fence after you get rocked, that guy's going to finish you.
Yeah.
If that's your defensive game. So, like, it was kind of a matter of time before something like this happened to Gunnar Nelson. I wasn't sure that Ponzinibbio was going to be the guy to do it. I mean, I think I figured Nelson would Nelson his way out of it. But like Ponzinibbio is a really good combination puncher, and he's really powerful, and he's crafty in how he puts things together. He's got good footwork, and it is not entirely surprising that he did this.
Yeah, I think the defense is the big thing. Like, not to say, oh, there's something dramatically wrong with Gunnar Nelson, but I was happy that I emphasized this last week in all of my many discussions on, how I expected this fight to play out. I'm a bit of a Gunnar Nelson hater, even if I try not to be. I think I kind of fall, I'm like a contrarian by nature, Pat. So, I think what happens is I see that Gunnar Nelson's a little overrated by a lot of people. And even though that shouldn't leach into my analysis, I think it does. A lot of people think that Gunnar Nelson is just waiting right on the edge of a title shot. And I don't think he's that guy. I think he's got some real fundamental flaws holding him back. Or maybe if you want to spin it this way, he has some serious stylistic limitations that are going to be really hard for him to overcome. And so I see him as a perennial, just under the top 5 kind of guy. In such a deep division, I just think he doesn't have a chance of holding a position any higher than that. And so, unfortunately, sometimes I talk about him and I'm like, I find it really hard to pick Gunnar Nelson's fights because it's like, I know he's not the best in the world, but I have too many doubts about my reasons for evaluating him to trust my own analysis. I was happy that this time the emphasis, though, was on his hitability. He came into this fight with 51% striking defense, which is not mediocre, it's bad. You know, like, that's a bad number. You should not accept and take on the chin half the strikes your opponent wants to land. You are giving them
It's not just strikes on the chin. He's not necessarily that easy to hit to the head because he's rarely there to be hit in that sense. But, like, if you want to kick his legs, you can kick his legs. If you want to hit him in the body, you can hit him in the body. It's just not that common that guys have been able to exploit his head defense, though Albert Tumanov hit him there. Basically, everybody, Alan Jouban landed some good headshots. Rick Story landed on him there, too. It's just that most guys end up attacking his legs and body instead because those are super there. Yeah. But if you're looking for comparative numbers here, good strikers tend to be in the 60 to 70% range for striking defense, and Nelson is at 50. So take that as you will.
He's way below, and it's not all shots on the chin, but with a really low volume style, that only becomes more worrying. Like, Nelson is a guy who gets outlanded even in most of his wins against top fighters. They will throw and they will land more. He's devastating when he gets that one shot. Likewise, he's devastating when he gets the takedown. But I just don't see a ton of process to it. And I honestly just don't think that defense on the whole is a focus for Nelson. I think he is always thinking, how can I set up my next thing? That's part of what makes him dangerous. I think he's very confident and very composed. He always has, like, even if he's not a very strategic mind, he always has the idea in his head that he's looking to finish the guy in front of him. And maybe his opponents are thinking, I got to figure him out, or I got to look out for this. Nelson is always looking for what he can do to you to put you away. Makes him really dangerous. But, like, there was a moment right there at the end of this fight. Ponzinibbio took a few shots. Nelson surprised him with his speed, and he was throwing a lot more, which is something we've seen in recent Gunnar Nelson fights that we didn't give enough credit to last week, I don't think. He has been a little more aggressive, at least, and pursuing his range more actively, which I like. It's great for a low-volume guy. Do something, like Tyron Woodley could use that. Do something to put yourself in position to use your speed and power. But Ponzinibbio needed a couple of those exchanges before he realized he needed to make an adjustment. And when it came to the stage of making adjustments, which happened very soon in the fight, Ponzinibbio was clearly, to me, a step ahead of Nelson. He kind of marches forward behind a jab. He looks for an inside angle, tries to kind of pivot around Nelson's lead leg as he throws his jab, and Nelson lets him before he adjusts. He gives him like a second of time at an inside angle before he adjusts. So Ponzinibbio just thinks, I'll do it again. So he gets really close, takes little steps, and then if you watch a replay of the knockout, these two tiny shuffle steps to his left from Ponzinibbio, they just line up his right shoulder with Gunnar Nelson's chin. And Nelson doesn't seem to notice. He just sees Ponzinibbio standing a little too close, jumps in for his left hook, and feeds his jawline right into the right hand that Ponzinibbio just set up. He just didn't seem aware. Did you notice
Ponzinibbio's adjustment steps in that finishing combination? Like, as Nelson was trying to move and trying to get out, Ponzinibbio stayed square in front of him by taking small adjustment steps as he threw. Like, that is brilliant footwork.
We have seen since the Zach Cummings fight that Ponzinibbio really is capable of doing some beautiful moves with his feet.
He's a really good striker. He may actually be the most dangerous pure striker who's in his prime in this division. I think Robbie Lawler is still the most dangerous, but at least until proven otherwise. But in terms of his ability to do a lot of different things with great fundamentals and produce volume while still having a good chance of taking your head off, that's probably Ponzinibbio right now.
And he seems to really have just come into his prime, and he may even still be making refinements. So it wasn't a huge shock to me that Ponzinibbio won here as it was to so many others. And it's always going to be hard for me, I think, to pick Gunnar Nelson fights.
Well, you and I have been high on the Pons for a long time.
Yeah,
like, we've been talking about Ponzinibbio since we both picked him to beat Lorenz Larkin in 2015.
Yeah, you know, and I think people were underrating that 4-fight winning streak he carried into this. Like, the fight with Nordine Taleb, I think another underrated guy who is also really finding his place in the division, really finding his style. Zach Cummings, always underrated, a very solid, reliable fighter. Court McGee, a veteran. Like the last 3 guys he beat before Gunnar Nelson, those are respectable wins. They say something about what Ponzinibbio has managed to do with himself, like the position he's found in his career. So it wasn't a huge shock, but I think now I can move on to the stage where instead of like accidentally hating on Gunnar Nelson, I say, you know what? I root for him to make the changes I think he needs. And if the sudden failure of a usually very trusty chin is not the surest wake-up call Gunnar Nelson's ever going to get, then he needs to start investing time in his defense. If he does not hear that wake-up call, then he's going to be sleeping forever. You know what I mean? Like now is the time for Gunnar Nelson to become or decide that he will never will be a staple top 5 fighter. I don't think he has enough time left to sort of faff around and take a few more losses like this before that lesson sinks in. And it's going to be a challenge for Nelson to find a little more defensive acumen without maybe damaging what he sees as his style. But I think it is possible, and I'm hoping to see it because I have had to, through a lot of wrong picks, come to appreciate the talent of Gunnar Nelson. Like I imagine, if Gunnar Nelson's not working with Owen Roddy, he strikes me as the kind of guy who could, with just a year under Owen Roddy, turn into a much better kickboxer, just like Conor McGregor and Artem Lobov have. I think Roddy's one of the best guys at that team, if not the best trainer at SBG, and Nelson doesn't seem to work with him. But again, those incorrect picks have forced me to reckon with Nelson's speed and his confidence and his power. You know, he's a very talented fighter, and it's just been a lack of fundamentals that once again has held him back. So, I don't know. What are your thoughts on Nelson? Do you think he can overcome this, or do you think it's just kind of this is his style and he's sort of stuck in it?
I think it's kind of his style, and he's more or less stuck in it. And I think when it works, it's going to work really big. And Gunnar Nelson's fans are going to be like, how could you not have picked him to win this fight? And when it doesn't work, it's going to look a lot like this.
Yeah.
I think he's a dude who, and this speaks to Nelson's personality. I mean, not that this is a bad thing. Like, I think he's a dude who's out there doing things that he finds personally satisfying. And that's why he does martial arts, and that's why he fights, and like thinks of himself as an artist in that sense. And like in that kind of way of thinking about it, it's more about honing the things that he wants to do rather than trying to make himself like objectively the best fighter in the world. And like I think if Nelson decides like, oh man, boxing's really cool, I want to learn more about boxing, then he would throw himself into it, and he'd probably be really good at it. But I think he's kind of decided that this is the stuff that he wants to be doing, and this is how he wants to do it, and he's going to see how far that takes him.
Don't you get the feeling, though, like Gunnar Nelson personality-wise reminds me of Rory McDonald. And don't you get the feeling that if he had the sort of strong guidance that Rory McDonald's gotten from his coaches, that we could see something better from Nelson? Or do you think maybe he's a little more strong-willed than Rory and just kind of has to have his own way?
I think Rory is an extremely regimented person.
Yeah.
And I don't think that Gunnar Nelson is necessarily that way. Like Nelson he's a wanderer. He's taken years off to go do things that he thinks are enjoyable. He took time to wrestle and time to just go do jiu-jitsu and time to do this and time to do that. And like, that's kind of how he rolls. He's a free spirit. And
careful, you're kind of making me a fan of Gunnar Nelson. He's kind of a fascinating character.
He is a fascinating character.
Yeah, he really is.
Being a fascinating character with a devastating and really interesting game. Like, I think as analysts, we have to separate that out from what it is that he actually does in the cage. And you can like him and be really intrigued by him on that one level, I think, without necessarily overrating what he does as a fighter. And I think this is I think this is why we get so much shit when we talk about Gunnar Nelson, frankly, is because those two things are not separable to the mind of a fan the way they are maybe to us.
Yeah, and then that pressure does genuinely make it hard to pick his fights, for me at least. Like, it's not to give myself an out, it's not what I'm trying to do, but just to give you guys an understanding, like, it's tough for me to have confidence sometimes in a decision. Like, I have a feel about how a fight is going to go, and then I don't know if that feeling has been generated by, you know, what I've heard about how I pick Gunnar Nelson's fights wrong, or what I think I actually know and how much of what I actually know about Gunnar Nelson is influenced by my feelings towards him and his fans. Like, it's tough. It's not always easy to just make a prediction, which is why we don't tend to put too much of our energy into it. So let's be thankful for our Gunnar Nelson fight. They're always fun, and this time it was a loss, but Santiago Ponzinibbio really, I think, established himself as somebody who has to be watched out for in the welterweight division.
Who do you want to see the Pons fight?
You know, Zane Simon recommended Ponzinibbio versus... Oh, wait, who did he recommend? Hold on. It was like a top 10 welterweight versus Jorge Masvidal. I would absolutely be down for that.
I think they train together.
Oh, do they?
They could probably make that work. But...
ATT, so they might be able to make it work. But if possible, I mean, I think that would be a beautiful fight, which would really... Like, there's an opportunity there from both guys to look good.
I would like to see him fight Kamaru Usman for a title shot. That's for the next shot at the title. That would be my preference.
Good shout. Or perhaps Colby Covington?
Also an ATT guy.
Oh, damn it. Damn you, ATT. Break down the camps, goddammit. We need more people willing to fight each other. Yeah, I like that.
I see your recent interest in anti-monopoly is shining through in MMA, Connor.
Yeah, I like that, though. Pons versus all of his fellow employees, but also Pons versus Kamaru Usman sounds pretty legit. I'm down with that.
I think the Usman fight is the right one to make because stylistically the UFC would probably rather have Ponzinibbio be a guy who's contending.
Yeah.
And also you can do more. You can do a lot with him marketing wise, I think, because he's from Argentina, but he's also well known in Brazil. He was on The Ultimate Fighter. Like, I think Ponzinibbio is not an unmarketable guy. Like, you could do a fit with him. He's a nice entry point into a new market. So, but like, I think you want to put him in there with like Usman could be just the dude to do it. And if you want Usman to have the shot at being that guy, like, you want to put him in there with somebody who can probably force him into an exciting fight and force him to dig. So,
yeah.
But I think this division is old as shit, and you need to get one of those guys in there soon.
Yeah, there's an opportunity for Ponzinibbio there. He was definitely a I do my talking with my fists kind of guy, but in the best sense. Like, after this fight, he had his post-fight interview. He was extremely respectful and generous towards Gunnar Nelson, talked with sort of the pride, I think, of a craftsman who, like, he had humility, but he knows he's good at what he does. And of course he's got an accent, speaks English well with an accent, which the UFC seems to really like for marketing purposes. You know, Gennady Golovkin over in boxing, there seems to be something in that American audiences are sort of fascinated by well-spoken people who clearly did not grow up speaking English. So who knows? I think Ponzinibbio could be marketed. He came across very well this weekend, and especially after the win over Nelson. And with the win. I mean, who the hell doesn't want to see more fights like that?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Let's talk about the rest of the card. Calvillo.
Yeah.
Calder.
Yeah, I think there were two fights to go over, right? Like, Khalil Roundtree and Cynthia Calvillo.
Yeah, that works for me. And I do want to give a shout out to Leslie Smith, but as far as actual analysis, which will also have to be brief, let's talk about Calvillo over Calderwood first.
Well, so I think it makes sense to treat Roundtree and Calvillo as a pair here because they're both prospects.
Okay.
They're both pretty young in their careers. And these two fights are, to me, a really good example of why you need to take aging curves and time in the sport seriously.
Yeah.
Right. So even though they both won, Calvillo on paper got a good win over a tough Joanne Calderwood and it has announced herself as a solidly top 15 strawweight. But not all wins are created equal. And if you look at what Calvillo did in that fight, her striking game showed some real holes against a rangy, effective, but not especially dangerous striker in Calderwood. But more worrisome for the kind of game that she's actually really good at playing, her takedown entries were crap, and her takedowns were not especially good. She managed to get the fight into places where she could scramble and work her wizardry on the mat, but that is not going to be a reliable path against better defensive wrestlers than Calderwood and better scramblers and grapplers than Calderwood.
If we think about the division as a conveyor belt, what's our ultimate goal here? Calvillo versus Jędrzejczyk. Would that level of takedown ability and that level of distance management work against Joanna? Not even close. She'd have a 5% chance of winning that fight, if that, with what she showed against Calderwood.
So it's one of those fights where you take the win and you're like, okay, this is it's good that she won that fight. But instead of looking at just the fact that she won and looking at the fact that she beat Calderwood, who I think is kind of like, that is not maybe as impressive as it would have been in 2015. Like, the Calderwood did not look right to me. She missed weight. She has not looked great for a while. Like, she's not turned into the fighter that maybe we thought she'd be. But like, so all credit to Calvillo for winning that. But sometimes even in a win, you got to look at what happened there. And even in a fight where you didn't necessarily look bad, and you got to see there are real holes here and there are real things that have to be worked on. And Calvillo is so young in her career that, like, it's going to take time for those things to work themselves out. That's not a knock on her. It's just the nature of how building a young fighter in this sport works.
Yeah, I think Calderwood is probably going through some mid-career growing pains of her own as well. I think these are, if we're looking at fighter development, these are essentially the last, what I hope are the last vestiges of, puberty, where she's like learning to box a little better, she's learning these fundamentals, and that she will be a fully formed fighter soon. But who knows, with a couple losses, not looking remarkable, I hope she can hang around long enough to show what I think she has been working on and what's made her look a lot less impressive. But with Calvillo, I saw you tweeting about this. I'm glad to hear you say what you just said, because I saw you tweeting after the fight about, pumping the brakes on the Calvillo hype train, and I thought you might have been implying that, like, oh, we just learned that Calvillo is not going to be a contender, and so let's not get excited. I'm glad to hear you say basically, like, she's not going to be a contender if we keep pushing her higher than this level. Like, she needs to step back.
She needs to fight more kind of fringe top 15 strawweights.
Yeah.
And she needs mostly because she needs time in the gym. Like, pushing her into fight after fight after fight is not necessarily what she needs. What she needs is 3 months in the gym to work on fundamentals and basics. And she needs sparring sessions, and she needs drilling sessions, and she needs just time, because that's what it takes. And it's not the fight that does it. It's the training camp before the fight.
Another opponent or two, I think, know better than Joanne Calderwood, like, at that level. I think that we found a level where Calvillo needs to show she can break through before she potentially has her potential wasted by throwing her to the wolves. I think really it may have been a very difficult style matchup for Calvillo. So much like the Blades versus Omialanchuk fight, we learned some things about Calvillo's limitations, and maybe also some things about how well she does continue to plug away in the face of adversity. I was starting to get really nervous when this fight was about to begin, because I realized I'd kind of overlooked just how difficult it might be for Calvillo, who is not an amazing takedown artist, to make the ground game happen when all she had to rely on was boxing, and Calderwood was going to use her frame and kick her to pieces as often as possible. That set of weapons and the build of Calderwood may have really been a bigger problem for Calvillo than I thought. And it was obviously a problem. She really had a hard time for long stretches of getting anything going, but she wasn't mentally broken by it. So there are good things to take away from this fight for Calvillo. And you compared her to Khalil Roundtree. I think you could say the same thing about his fight with Paul Craig. Granted, Craig, a different opponent, because unlike Calderwood, he really did not fight a great fight against Roundtree. He seemed to make some very strange decisions, whereas Calderwood looked like the tough stylistic matchup that maybe I should have expected her to be. But Roundtree did everything he really should have done with the matchup he was given.
So Craig's plan was to be all the way out or all the way in, and Roundtree made it impossible for him to get all the way in. Because Craig did not think – there's no way that Craig thought he was going to win this fight by kicking Roundtree on the outside. I think he thought that's what he's going to do until Roundtree rushes in, makes a mistake, then I clinch him, take him down, and I submit him. Like, that's Craig's game. That's what he wanted to do here. And Roundtree, like, people were like, well, how do you know that Roundtree has really made improvements? I know because he didn't rush in, because he didn't do anything stupid, because the timing on his counters was good, because he looked relaxed, fluid, because he controlled the distance, because he didn't overcommit. He never gave Craig the opportunity to do the thing that would have allowed Craig to win the fight.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time evaluating prospects, and it's not just about the things that they show in terms of, like, raw skills. Like, would it have made everybody feel better if Craig had gotten in the clinch, couldn't make anything happen, couldn't get a takedown, or had gotten Roundtree to the ground and Roundtree escapes? The whole point of Roundtree's game was that he made it impossible for Craig to even get to that.
Yeah, you don't have to meet all of your shortcomings and flaws head on. You can find ways to hide them behind other layers. And I think that's what we're seeing from Roundtree here. There were signs that he was focusing on the right techniques, that his focus had shifted in the right way in that Daniel Jolly fight. But again, of course, 52 seconds of fight time, the first exchange leads to the knockout. The sample size was too small to have any confidence going into this that Roundtree really had, that there were layers to the little instant of like wrestling he showed in that fight against not a great wrestler. This time around, Craig was still not a great wrestler, but we got to see more of what Roundtree, I think, maybe would have tried to show us in the Jolly fight, and I really liked it. And aside from distance management, aside from some really nice counter-punching, and also managing his energy, like not throwing too much, picking his shots really well, I also liked the swagger. I like that he let his inner Anderson Silva out a little bit. He sort of had fun with Craig, and even to the point that it upset a lot of people when he stood over Craig's unconscious body for a full 10 seconds after knocking him out. But Roundtree, if you saw him on The Ultimate Fighter, he's a guy who I think has problems with insecurity. And
he used to weigh like 300 and something pounds.
Yeah,
and
he's not the most confident guy in the world, and I don't think there's anything really wrong with him just putting on a show about like, look how fucking comfortable I feel right now. Like, this is, I like that swagger. I thought it was a good sign.
Yeah, Roundtree's insecurities to me have not played out quite the way in the cage that they would for somebody like Uriah Hall. Yeah. Like, when Roundtree is fighting insecurely, he's throwing things way too hard. He's throwing way too fast. He's not managing his gas tank. He's not managing his energy. Like, even when Uriah Hall has been overcoming his personal demons, that kind of comfort that Roundtree showed in his last couple of fights was not there, Like, you could always see the nervousness there. And this version of Roundtree, like, maybe at some point that, like, those issues will come back to bite him again. But if he does this, there's no reason for him to ever feel that way.
Right.
Like, he looked relaxed.
He looked very comfortable. An interesting intersection, right, between like personality and insecurity. Uriah Hall won't let himself win at times. He's what's holding himself back. And then Roundtree, his problem is like the self-fulfilling prophecy that he responds with like fury to the insecurity that's holding him back. But that means he won't allow himself to lose, which means he does lose. Two different reactions, but both guys, like, there are clear signs in this fight that Roundtree is doing something to, if not overcome those issues, at least to mask them and find a way to fight around them. So I was pleased because I had high hopes for Roundtree, and then they were kind of summarily dashed by those 2 straight losses in the UFC. I was really happy to see him against a credible, experienced opponent, if perhaps a forgivable style matchup, show a really nice game plan and a really nice execution.
Yeah, the reason that I wanted to bring him up with Calvillo, and the reason I thought it made sense to talk about them as a pair, is because Roundtree got the weight of expectations placed on him really quickly. Mm-hmm. Like, as he had his first pro fight, Gui Cruz of MMA Fighting wrote an article about him through the like Anderson Silva and Lyoto Machida connection. Like, that dude was hyped from his very first fight.
First fight was an RFM, and he was basically on the second biggest tier from the beginning of his career.
Yeah, and he was a guy who was pushed. He was a guy who was in the gym with killers from day one. Yeah. Like, he was on The Ultimate Fighter within a year and a half of his pro debut. Like, he got pushed really, really, really quickly. And it became clear, like, what those limitations were when he was surrounded, not by, like, the world's most elite fighters, but by well-rounded journeymen and veterans. Mm-hmm. That's, like... And you don't want to write that guy off when he struggles in that sense. You don't want to write him off when he gets ground out by Andrew Sanchez, who had a ton of experience against good fighters, who's a real good grinder. Like, the fact that Roundtree got ground out by that guy is not the end of his career. Yeah. The fact that he got taken down and choked out by Tyson Pedro, who's an incredibly talented prospect in his own right, is not the end of his career. Sometimes it just takes some time, and it's okay. Yeah. You don't have to write guys off.
This performance from Roundtree is the reason we should not yet write off Cynthia Calvillo, just because she didn't look as good as we expected. Like,
not just write her off, but also why you shouldn't jump all over and be like, she's the next big thing.
Sure, yeah, you need to wait and see.
Yeah, like, it's fine. Like, there's this rush in this sport, and I understand it now that, like, I've been around it for long enough. like, I understand there's always the rush to find who's going to be the next big thing. And you and I are both guilty of that at various points, of trying to find who's going to be the next big thing and to talk about prospects and future champions and things like that. And that's great. That's part of what makes the sport fun and exciting. But it also exercises a distorting lens on the way that we look at all these really talented fighters.
Right.
That, like, these are years-long processes. And sometimes fighters don't blossom until 3 or 4 or 5 years after you think they will.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes they never do.
The fact that the system can be proven to work with the occasional standout like a Cody Garbrandt or a John Jones, who even then was actually matched fairly carefully early on. But, like, I think those make it a little too easy for both matchmakers and analysts like us alike to forget that, like, Robert Whittaker wasn't the man he is today 4 years ago. And Cynthia Calvillo, for better or worse, is not the woman today that she'll probably be in the cage 2 years from now. And Khalil Roundtree, a helpful reminder that is true. Whether you end up falling apart or reaching your potential, it's just too hard to say. You need a sample size, right? That's what we have to look at it mathematically and say, we need enough samples to look at to make a conclusion here. And until we have those, all we can really do is speculate as to where this person is going. Shout out to Leslie Smith, as promised. Speaking of rushing people into tough matchups, we knew it was tough for Amanda Lemos. She looked super dangerous, though, as she looked in the regional circuit. And I just love seeing Leslie Smith getting technically better while also just still being a gritty maniac who can use tenacity and toughness and confidence as bludgeons against less experienced opponents. And also Leslie Smith calling out Betch Correia, saying that Betch has helped build everyone else's career, and now Leslie Smith wants to use her to build hers. I like that. So I like seeing Leslie Smith kind of announce herself as a contender and show the improvements that she would need to justify that kind of attitude.
Shouts to MMA union advocate Leslie Smith, who had the balls to ask Kobe Bryant about what the NBA Players Association did for him at the Athlete Summit.
Yeah.
She is awesome. If you don't like Leslie Smith, just fuck right off.
She's incredibly lovable, man. She's like so cheerful. She's a very peaceful personality, but also a maniac in the cage. She's Lady Diaz and is also just her own unique person. So if you're not rooting for Leslie Smith, then you are missing out. Let's go ahead and cover what we have coming out this week, unrelated to the show, before we wrap the show up. What do you have coming out this week in written or other audio form, Pat? And a long silence. Pat?
Shit, I realized I just had myself muted. I was talking for a solid 7 seconds before I realized that.
I got to leave that in
written,
now.
But I have a ton of audio stuff.
Okay.
I'm launching my new show this week, The Tides of History.
Yes.
If you're into history, I have 2 episodes dropping on Thursday. It's a brand new feed. You can go subscribe now in Apple Podcasts, anywhere else where you have it. Just search for Tides of History. And you can listen to the trailer there. There's a trailer up. But yeah, subscribe now. You'll get 2 new episodes coming Thursday. I'll have another episode coming next week, an interview episode. This is where I'm going to have new Fall of Rome episodes. I'm also doing a kind of a parallel series on the rise of the modern world that's under this banner. But subscribe to Tides of History. This is where you'll get all of your new Fall of Romes, all of your new Rise of the Modern Worlds, all the new interviews. It's going to be a big deal. Like, it's got sound design and production quality, and like it's wildly better than what I've been doing.
This man went to a recording studio to record this podcast.
I went to a recording studio. I had a script consultant.
Holy shit!
I had there's a sound designer to put in music and like sound effects and things like that. So it is. No, it's like a full-on production, man. Like, but I would appreciate it if everybody, even if you don't listen to it, for God's sake, please go download it.
Make it a big debut, goddammit. Yeah. And share and spread the word. Yeah, let people know. Pat's Fall of Rome has been fantastic, and the shows are good enough that I should say to anyone who may not have checked it out that we're lucky to still have Pat here, right? He's achieved a lot of great success with the new show, and for very good reason. And you guys owe it to yourselves to go check out the other stuff that he's working on. I'm looking forward to it, man. I think I've loved Fall of Rome. I'm really looking forward to seeing, just more of that, but also we both have a passion for certain aspects of the 15th, 16th centuries. So I think both should be a lot of fun. And Pat, as you may know from the way he explained MMA on this show, is very good at explaining what may be complicated history facts in a very accessible, narrative-driven way. So,
yeah, if you've ever wondered why we live in a sovereign state, it's something we all kind of take for granted, right? Like, why do we live in a country that has a central government and a defined chain of authority all the way from like your neighborhood council to the city to the state to the nation to the federal, all the way up to the federal government? Why do we live in that, and why don't we live in city states? Why don't we live in like leagues of towns that are banded together? Why don't we live under the authority of a local lord? Well, that's a historical story there. Like, there are reasons for that. Yeah. That's what I'm doing in this first episode of the Rise of the Modern World that comes out on Thursday, is like that it wasn't inevitable that was going to happen. That's not the only way that you can organize human beings politically. So that's kind of the story that I'm trying to tell there, is how do we end up in that situation, and why does it matter? So I hope, like, I'm not trying to do like a BuzzFeed-ish type of history thing here.
Yeah.
Like where it's, 7 cool things to know about the Roman Empire. Like, no, man, I want to explain why the world is the way it is.
Yeah.
Like,
but just like this show, it's like you're getting into you're giving historical perspective. You're giving people the stories they need to know to maybe better understand the stories they're living now.
Yeah, that's the whole goal, and I hope you don't have to be like a PhD to understand what I'm doing here.
No,
like,
not at all.
I will lay it out and explain it.
No, it's very, very accessible, and it's hard not to get sucked into it once you get a couple minutes into any of those Follow Rome episodes. So go check that out. As for me, I am working on an MMA Garage piece. I want to look at some of the improvements I'd like to see, although it may be a little too late for some of them, from some of the fighters from last week's card. Gunnar Nelson's going to be headlining that one. I'm going to talk about his need for defensive awareness and some of the adjustments, maybe like one succinct technique he could add to his game that might help him forge a new path going forward rather than just accepting the fate that seems to have been laid out for him. And then I want to do still a piece on Robert Whittaker. I want to do a bit of a narrative and technique piece where I sort of look at the romance of a win like Robert Whittaker's, why I thought it was so great when other people who maybe weren't as invested just saw sort of a slow tactical fight. I really saw something brilliant. And I want to talk about that before we forge ahead to UFC 214 week proper. So still talking about Whittaker versus Romero, and I'm not ashamed of it, goddammit, because I loved that fight. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed today's show. Get at us with your questions or comments on social media. You can find Pat at Patrick_Wyman on Twitter.com. And at the same location, you can find me at Boxing Bush. That's BUSCH. Check us out on Patreon. Please subscribe to the show. We put out a lot of great bonus content. There will be a bonus episode coming out next week. Pre-UFC 214, I believe, covering the events of UFC Long Island in more detail, because we will not have time to do so next week. And we hope that it's worth your while, and we think it is. If you haven't subscribed already or become a patron, go check us out on patreon.com. Just search Heavy Hands Podcast, and you'll find us. Otherwise, thank you all for tuning in. We will catch you next week. And if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.